Welcome, everybody. So, last class we discussed Lent and some of the Lenten traditions and rules. The class before that, we ended with a discussion of Israel's unified monarchy, and we talked about the reign of King Solomon. And when we left off, the main issue was that Solomon, while a very wise king and a king who expanded Israel's borders, he did not remain faithful to the covenant with God. He did not remain faithful to worshiping only the one true God. He strayed off, he worshiped other deities, he built altars and idols and the like. And this caused God to decide that because of this, he was going to punish the descendants of Solomon by splitting the kingdom in two. However, for the sake of David, who was still very much someone that God had felt very endearing towards, he considered David a man after my own heart. Thus says the Lord. God says in that title, he says when he calls David a man after my own heart. And because of this, that's he likes him. He thought David was overall an all right guy. So he looks at Solomon and says, look, for David's sake, I'm not going to have the kingdom fall apart on his son. It'll be his grandson. Okay. So what we're now going to look at is the division of Israel. So Israel is going to split into two separate kingdoms at this point. We're going to look at why that happened, and we're going to look at some of the important events from the kingdom of Israel, the northern of these two kingdoms. So let's talk about it. All right, so Rehoboam alienates the northern tribes. This leads a man by the name of Jeroboam to rise up as a leader of the northern 10 tribes. So here's what happens. When Rehoboam comes to power, when he is made the next king, one of the issues that comes to light is the discontent of the northern tribes. Now, Israel had a system of taxation, just like most kingdoms, like most nation states do. However, their tax wasn't always collected in coin. It wasn't always collected in money, nor in kind, aka in bartered goods. Rather, a lot of it was through labor. You could almost call it sweat equity. The idea was that you, as an able-bodied man in the kingdom, were required to provide X number of years or weeks or days of service in whether it was in the Royal Army or in building projects or things like that. So that was their tax. You had to work for the government rather than pay the government. Okay. Well, King Solomon hadn't always been 100% equal with which tribes he demanded most of this labor tax from, and the north was feeling overburdened. See, Israel, despite being one country, Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, lay within the territory that had traditionally been enjoyed by the tribe of Judah. So Judah and the nearby tribe of Shimon, they usually enjoyed a little more, you don't want to really say royal privilege, but a little more royal privilege, right? They were, the king wasn't as hard on them as, say, Manasseh or Ephraim or Gad or Dan or one of these other tribes. So, long story short, many of the northern tribesmen felt disgruntled with the way that Solomon's government had dealt with them, and were hoping that his son might be more lenient, might be more fair. So he's about to be anointed king, and a delegation from the northern tribes approaches him, and they basically say, look, your father wasn't dealing straight with us. He overburdened us with labor. If you would lighten our burdens, we would gladly serve you. So the new king has to decide what he's going to do. And he consults with two different groups. Now, the first group are his royal advisors. Now, these are kind of the wisest, the most sage individuals in all of, the Israelite kingdom. These are, to use to put in comparison to modern day, these are the equivalent of your career generals and career diplomats. These are professionals. They've been in this job for a while, A lot of them served Solomon for years, and his reign lasted around 40 years. And some of them were even veterans from when King David reigned. So these are not new guys. They're not new on the block. They've seen a thing or two. They know what they're doing. They tell them, look, the concern is valid that was brought to you. If you kind of a little bit goes a long way in these kind of things. If you let up even a little on them, they're gonna feel listened to, and they're gonna flock to you. And then he consults with his younger colleagues, and these were kind of the princes of the palace. These are the dandies. They're the young men. These are, his brothers and cousins and the children of other elites, and they all kind of hung out together. And so these are his friends of his own age that Rehoboam then consults with, and he asks them, what do you think I should do? And they're like, no, you got to lay down the law with them. You're the king. You got to lay down the law with these people and explain that you're not going to let up one bit. So Rehoboam's got a choice to make. He could listen to the career seasoned advisors, or he could listen to his young rowdy friends. Yeah, turns out he's not as smart as Solomon. He quickly decides, nope, I'm going to lay down the law. So that's what he does. He shows up and he gives this speech where he says, I think it's something to the effect of, my finger is as thick as my father's thigh. He beat you with whips, I will beat you with scorpions. AKA, you thought he was tough? You thought he was bad? I'm worse. I'm going to be 10 times harder, 10 times stricter. If you thought he was strong, you haven't seen anything until you see what I can bring to the table. And the northern tribes are like, forget him. We're done with it. That's how he's going to be about it. We're out. And they left. The 10 northern tribes, they left. And they go off, and God raises up this one man in their midst, Jeroboam. And he is, he rises up. He's kind of, he's a powerful, charismatic figure. And many of them proclaim him king. He becomes the new king over the northern kingdom. So now we've got a split in Israel. The 10 northern tribes remain as one kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. The lower two tribes, Judah and Shimon, remain under the reign of Rehoboam. So now we've split. We've got one religion, two kingdoms. However, Jeroboam soon finds he's got a problem. What's the problem? The temple to God is still in Jerusalem, which is ruled over by Rehoboam. So every year, Israelites from the north journey south to Jerusalem for the Feast of Passover and to celebrate other religious rites. And he begins to grow nervous. The more these people flock to Jerusalem, the more Jerusalem remains an important epicenter for them because it's the center of their worship. And, well, who's king now? Well, Rehoboam is king in Jerusalem. Are they going to start thinking of him as king? Am I going to lose my kingdom? So he's like, I got to get them to not go down there. But that's a problem. The temple is down there. The Ark of the Covenant, the original golden chest in which they put the original tablets of the Ten Commandments from Mount Sinai. And that's an important object of veneration. It's where God was traditionally worshipped. Traditionally, the sanctuary where God was worshipped was always where the Ark of the Covenant was. And the Ark of the Covenant is in the temple, and the temple is in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is where Rehoboam is. That ain't going to do. So Jeroboam's got to figure out, what is he going to do? And he comes up with an idea. Golden calves. And you're probably thinking to yourself, what? Why? Why golden calves? What possessed him to think that was going to be the solution? Well, remember, these are idols, not false gods. Jeroboam still worships God. He just thinks God lives in a statue of a cow. I know that sounds like a ridiculous sentence to us today, but that's what he thought. And there was a bit of a political reason for that thought. See, if the Israelites kept going down, because as far as they're concerned, God tends to be, or tends to appear, or tends to have a thing for the spot where the Ark of the Covenant is, he realizes they're going to continue going down there. So he's got to convince them, no. God's up here. He's up here in the northern kingdom. You don't have to go. So he erects two idols, and he puts one in the city of Dan, located where the tribe of Dan is, and the other in the tribe of Bethel. I mean, in the city of Bethel. There's no tribe of Bethel. I'm sorry. The city of Bethel. And he says, there you go. You got two worship centers. You can go to either one, whichever one is more convenient to you. It's a pretty clever gig in a way. And this touches off what we like to call the divided monarchy. So from this point onward, we will have two separate kingdoms. One for Israel and one for Judah. So if we look up here, this is a chart. This is one my professor gave me, and you guys can take a look at it. It's one I like to use a lot as a clear and easy reference. Reign of Saul, roughly 232, 210-ish BC. David's reign begins in 210, ends in 970. There's a little smidgen there where Ishbaal reigned for a little bit. Then Solomon, and then we see the reigns. And they're color-coded based on dynasty, based on being in the same family. We're going to look at that in a second as to why these things are different. So let's talk about it a little more. So one of the things we start to see is a diverging question on kingship. What's the deal with kings and God's relation with kings? This is a bit of a big question because it is spiritual and it is political at the same time. And nowadays, we as Americans, we kind of have a drill in our head that, you want to keep your religion and your government separate, your theology and your civics. You want, sometimes they occupy more or less different spaces. That's really not what we do now in Israel. That's not what happened in Israel. To Israel, no. This was a moral question. So it was important very religiously. If we're going to have kings or judges, or what we're going to do is going to depend very much on what God regards as correct. And if you have two different opinions on the nature of kingship, that can quickly lead to two different political traditions regarding how kings work. So in Judah, in the kingdom of Judah, one of the ideas we get is the idea that there is an eternal dynasty, that when God made a covenant with David, that covenant was meant to last forever. That it meant that the political leader of Israel, the king of Israel, was to always be of the house of David. So it was always going to be a descendant of King David. And they believe, and to those in Judah, the interpretation was that this was meant to be an eternal dynasty, right? That God had favored out the descendants of David for rule, and that was going to be bound forever. So this was an irrevocable favor. Once God said, I like this family, they're in charge, that was it. Forever, they're going to be in charge. So to them, to Israelites, to the Jewish people living in the tribe of Judah and in the kingdom of Judah, the logic was the Davidic dynasty, the dynasty of David, was eternal. You couldn't get rid of the Davidic family and replace it with another, because that would be contrary to what God had promised David in his covenant. Now, that didn't mean the king was infallible. The king could make mistakes. The personal king could stray from God. And yes, you could, in dire circumstances, get rid of that king, but you had to replace him with another one from the same family line. So you could get, so if a king who was a descendant of David started worshiping idols and false gods, yeah, you could kick him out. But you'd have to replace him with another member of that same family, right? His brother or his son or his nephew or his cousin would have to take over, because the king always had to be a descendant of David. This also involves a historical outlook. To them, the monarchy was superior to the period of judges. So their attitude was the period of judges was chaos. You had all these tribes, each doing their own thing. And whenever one of them or a few of them would get in trouble, God would set up a leader, and that would last for a while. And then that leader would die. And then the people would go back and they'd grow lax in their ways and they get invaded. And there was no ability to enforce laws. There's a phrase you'll hear in a lot of the sources that come out of Judah at this time, which is when they describe the period of judges, you'll hear this phrase, for there was no king in those days, and each man did as he thought best. And their attitude was, look, this is anarchy. This is crazy talk. We've got, all these people just doing whatever they want. We can't have this. And they're like, oh, good, we have a king. Life was better with the king. Once we had a king, it was nice. We were a unified country. Our enemies were driven forth from our borders. Our borders were expanded. We gained respect among the nations. So good things. Now, to Israel, it's the opposite. To those who belong to the 10 tribes of northern Israel, no, that's not how kingship works. To them, the covenant was with David only. Yeah, God liked David, but that was, as far as they're concerned, an agreement with David only. It doesn't extend to his children. To them, dynasties are chosen by God. And if the dynasty has divine favor, then they will rule. And when they lose divine favor, they will no longer be in power. Now, you may wonder, okay, so how do they figure out who's got that divine rule, that divine mandate? And the answer is they kind of just say, well, let's look at what happens. If God is with them, then they're probably going to win battles. They're probably going to have success in statecraft. And if not, if they start losing battles and rebellions start forming, then maybe God doesn't like them so much. It's very similar to the whole mandate of heaven idea you see in ancient China. These ideas had different origin, but there's a similar idea, right? How do we know if they're still the chosen dynasty? Well, if things are going good for them. And if not, well, then maybe the powers that be don't want him to be in charge anymore. Is that really a logical or fully mature way to look at the situation? Maybe, maybe not. But regardless, that was their perspective. And as we see from the chart, in Israel, in the southern kingdom, we have a complete, like for example, their first king, Jeroboam, rules, and then his son, Nadab, comes to power. And then Nadab is overthrown by a guy named Baasha. Baasha's son, Elah, takes over. And then some guy named Zimri rises up to fight against him. They both don't make it past year 885 BC, and Omri comes to power. And the Omri dynasty goes for a while with Ahab, Azahiah, Jeroboam, Joram. And then after that, then Yehu comes to power, Jehoash, Jeroboam II, Zechariah, and then Shalom comes to power. I got a new family, and right. And each time, so each change of color, you've got a different family. And that comes from this idea of, well, when things are going good for them, then maybe God likes them. And if things start going bad, maybe don't like them too much. So, whereas if we look over at Judah's side, it's old, with the exception of a brief period where Athaliah was ruling. That's an interesting story. We'll talk about that in a second. That's a weird story. Basically, she's a descendant of Ahab. She intermarried with the previous Davidic king, and then she takes power, but it's a very brief business. But this idea that there is no eternal dynasty. Your family can gain or lose the support of God. And this is, to them, David's dynasty is a problematic anomaly. Why? Well, to them, kingship is based very much on the model of the judges. They see their kings as little more than judges. That if God likes a leader, he'll raise that person up and give them successes, and they'll be in charge. And that'll continue until such time as they stop doing what God wants. And so to them, they see kingship as an extension of that. To them, David and his dynasty are a problematic anomaly where the reign passed from father to son in a way contrary to how the judges would have done it. That's problematic to them. But to them, that's not the norm. And a big thing we got to share is this difference on the period of judges. To a historian of the northern tribes of Israel, the kingdom of Israel, the time of the judges was the best, right? This is when God himself chose leaders for the people. And other than that, the tribes just governed their own affairs. Whereas to Judah, no, this was anarchy. This was crazy time, right? So it's a very different perspective. All right. Now, one of the things we got to talk about is the writing of the Bible. So one of the things that starts to take shape in this period is writing out the Bible, is prose, right? What we would call not epic poetry, not songs and hymns, but actual written history of the Bible. The written stories of the Bible really start to take shape during this time period. What makes it difficult for us is that the books that will later form the Bible, the books of the Bible, are taking shape in ways that look very different from how we're used to seeing them. Now, we don't know much about who wrote these original things, and it may well have been multiple authors. So we know these two sources primarily as the Yahwist author or the Yahwist source and the Elohist source or the Elohist author. So we name them basically based on the title they use to refer to God. To the Yahwist source uses the Hebrew Yud He Vav He, which I'm going to write up real quick on the I'm going to write up real quick on the board behind me so you guys can see it. That is Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. The Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, or YH, VH, which how this is pronounced is not amazingly clear. It might, a lot of historians like to say it's pronounced Yahweh. This is a common one. A lot of people say this is how you would pronounce it. You pronounce it as Yahweh. Some say the pronunciation might be more like a Yah, they. It's made very difficult because in different languages, this letter is pronounced like a V or like a, it makes a V or a W, depending on what language you're using. Some say it might have this more of this sound. There's a few others. There's even one unique idea that says this, there's even a version of this where this can have an A ending or an U ending. That depends. It's unclear. So again, big problem with this is that in ancient Hebrew, there is no one, they don't have vowel letters in the proper Hebrew alphabet. The modern Hebrew alphabet uses small dots and dashes and marks underneath the letters to indicate where the vowels are. The problem is that didn't become a trend until the early Middle Ages. Think 600 to 800 AD is when we start to see that happen in Hebrew. The problem is, well before that, there became this tradition in Hebrew that this phrase, the Yud Hey Vav Hey, was the holy name of God. That this was a title of God so holy, so important, that it would only be said once by the high priest in the temple once a year. And because of that, because it was something that the high priesthood knew how to pronounce this word, when it came time to pronounce it, they use it. And the problem is there's about, give or take, there's well over 500 years between the collapse of the Second Temple and the I think 500 years at least between the collapse of the Second Temple, give or take 500, 300 years, several centuries between the collapse of the, well, 500 years between the Second Temple, and the rise of this vowel system in Hebrew. So no one, by the time they started writing the vowels down, actually knew what the vowels were in between these consonants. So that wasn't known. So because of that, we don't really know. Now, yes, if you look at a Tanakh, if you look at a Torah, a Hebrew Bible, you will, and you look at it in Hebrew, you will see in some prints dots and dashes here. The problem is those versions are usually produced for basically their equivalent of lectors, for people reading the words. And the problem is in the Hebrew language, they have a tradition known as, I believe it's Katim Kariv. My Hebrew is rusty. And it basically means you write it as you say it. So when they actually put vowels underneath this in the Middle Ages, what they did is they put vowels for the word you usually say in place of this, because you wouldn't pronounce this. You would instead they would just say the Lord or Adonai. So what you'd get is, so they put the vowels underneath for Adonai, as in, so that their lector would know, their person reading would know, oh, don't say this word, say Adonai, say the Lord. The same way that in most modern Bible translations where this word comes up, they'll just print the Lord. That's actually a carryover from that. But what happened was when historians, Bible translators suddenly started coming back to the Hebrew, they saw this and didn't realize what was going on. So a couple of German scholars got the bright idea to just insert the vowels where they were. So they insert the vowels for Adonai, the A, the O, and whatnot, the vowels, and they inserted them in between the YH, VH. And what you got was this sort of hybrid word, Jehovah, which is not a Hebrew word, but they took that, and then that moved across the Atlantic. And since Americans tend to pronounce, so the original scholars were German, so they wrote it with a J, because that's the letter they use for the yut sound. When they got to America, Americans just started pronouncing it just, so we got Jehovah. Hence, Jehovah's Witnesses and all that. But that's not really the word. That word doesn't even appear in the Bible. It's this YHVH. And again, we don't really know 100% how it's pronounced. The most common version you'll see, a lot of cardinals will use Yahweh, so it's probably the most accepted, at least in the Catholic Church. But it's that you will see some that'll pronounce it Yahweh. This has also made all the more complicated because depending on whether you grew up as an English speaker or a German speaker, how you pronounce this letter differs. So that doesn't make it any easier on our, what is this word? How is it pronounced? But anyway, long diatribe short, that's what you need to be aware of, is that the authors down in Judah, that's the word they use to refer to God. So when we see text with that word in it, that lets us know, okay, that belonged to a particular source. That is the Judean source for the content. Now, as historians, we call this the Book of J. Again, as I'm pointing out, a lot of the historians that first made this determination were German, so the Y sound was made by J, so they called it the Book of J, and that's just what it's known as. So what was in the Book of J? It appeared to contain what we would now consider Genesis chapter 2 through the book of Numbers. So a good chunk of Genesis, so Genesis beginning at chapter 2 through Numbers, the book of Numbers. It also included Joshua, the second half of the book of Judges, and what we would now consider the books of Samuel and First Kings, i.e., and later on even a little bit of Second Kings, really. Mainly the lives of David and Solomon would have been part of this book. And this would have been one of the main religious texts used, one of the main religious texts, one of the main historical texts in Judah, right? It was very, and actually, as you'd expect, it's very pro-Judah, right? This is where we see a lot of, stories that depict Judah in a good light. And it's very monarchist. This is the unabashedly monarchist part of the Bible. This is some of the most pro-king, pro-monarchy passages in the Bible come from this portion, which makes sense. This is the portion that believed that the country got infinitely better once God anointed David as king. That was a turning point for the better, that David and Solomon made Israel into a real powerhouse. And so to them, to historians and priests of the tribe of Judah, the monarchy was probably one of the best things to ever happen to God's people, right? They had security from their enemies. They had dominion over their enemies. The Ark of the Covenant goes from roaming around the countryside in a tent to having this magnificent temple built in the honor of God. They're like, how can you not see this as an improvement? The lowest source, sometimes known as the Book of E, contains a very different set of data. Now, the title they use there is the title Elohim, meaning God, the one and only. And this was separate from the general El, meaning God. This way, because the term El, meaning God, could mean God. It could also even mean like force of nature or power. That may sound weird, but remember, the Hebrew language is older than the Israelites. There are other people in the Mediterranean that use that language. What we would now call Carthaginians, and the let's see, Carthaginians, the Phoenicians, the Canaanites, with the exception of the Philistines, they all use that language. So Canaanites, Phoenicians, Carthaginians, etc. These are all people that use this language in addition to the Israelites. And as a result, they're all Hebrew speakers. They just speak it with a dialect, the same way that, American English and British English is, different. We have we pronounce words differently, use some different words in different cases, but it's still the same language, You can read a book written by a British author without needing to have it translated into American English, and vice versa. A British person can read a book written by an American author without needing it translated. Now, the Book of E, but anyway, we get back to the lowest thing. They didn't want to use the same term for God as the general term for powers. And the reason for this is, remember, in pagan cultures, there is no difference between a force of nature and a god. To pagan people, they're the same thing, right? In most pagan languages, in most polytheistic languages, the word for the thing, such as war or peace, or war, peace, the sun, the sky, the moon, whatever, they didn't have a separate name from the title for their god. The name for the thing was the name for the god. If you were talking to a Greek about warfare, and you were discussing, military, the institution of warfare, they'd refer to warfare as Ares. They wouldn't have a separate word for it. That was just it. Their term for it and their term for the deity were one and the same. So, to help differentiate the general pagan idea of a god that is just a force of nature versus God, the creator of the universe, all of that, the Israelites used a special term, right? And that term was Elohim, which is sort of a plural of El. Think of it like the royal we, right? The same way that a king or queen will address as we. They never say I, they always say we. The same is true of this, right? We're going to give it a plural name to imply the majesty of God over all the other forces of nature, all the other things that influence people and their lives and whatnot. Okay, cool. Anyway, this Elohim is the title they use to refer to God, and therefore this becomes known as the Book of E and as the lowest source or the lowest author. So what do we find in this book? Well, one, the Book of E, from what we know of it, is much shorter than the Book of J. It begins with the story of Abraham. We don't get a creation story in the Book E. We don't get a flood story either in the Elohist source. The Elohist source pretty much starts off with Abraham, and it goes through Numbers. It also has portions of what's now Joshua, and the first half of the book of Judges. It pretty much cuts out after the first half of Judges. We don't get really anything on Samuel. We don't really get anything on David or Solomon or Saul or any of that. It's very obviously it's pro-Israel. It's in favor of the 10 northern tribes. In fact, the tribes of Judah and Shimon are almost never mentioned in the passages we get from the Elohist author. It's also intensely anti-monarchy. There's a very clear bent about kings being evil or pagan or things like that. And it's very pro-judges. It takes this, if you're looking for happy stories from the period of Judges, from the Israel's tribal confederation period, you're probably reading a story that either is entirely written by the Elohist author or where the majority of the material is the Elohist author. If you're reading a story that depicts that period in a negative light, it's probably from the Yahwist author. All right, cool. But these two books would later go on to become some of the foundations of what we now call the Pentateuch, the five, or what our Jewish brothers and sisters call the Torah, right? The first 5 books of the Bible. All right, so let's talk about some of the most famous prophets from this period, Elijah and Elisha. And they preached against the sins of King Ahab and his queen Jezebel. And for this, they were persecuted by the king. Now, they're prophets, so they receive messages from God and they speak what God commands them to speak. And Elijah is rather interesting because he has a unique kind of thing. Elijah doesn't specifically die. He is described as being taken up to heaven in a fiery chariot. There's no description of him actually passing on. All right, so what is up with King Ahab? The name Ahab is probably gonna be familiar to many of us, whether it's because you've read the Bible or because your teacher assigned you the American novel Moby Dick, which features a captain by the name of Ahab, and you're wondering why the author picked that name of anything to be the name of the most terrible character in the book. Well, let's talk about Ahab, the biblical king. What's up with this guy? Well, Ahab ruled over Israel, so the northern kingdom, and he married a woman by the name of Jezebel. Now, she is a Sidonese princess. She's from Sidon. Sidon is one of the Phoenician city-states on the coast. So, in an effort to strengthen Israel's ties with the wider world, Ahab makes this marriage. Now, I'm not here to, apologize for Ahab or, make up excuses for him. Here's what I will say. In terms of political sense, this did make a lot of sense. See, under the period of David and Solomon, Israel is growing stronger, but they're also in a power vacuum. The major empires of the late Bronze Age, Third Dynasty Egypt, the initial Assyrian Empire, the Hittites, they had all kind of imploded. Even the Mycenaean Greeks are gone. The Trojans are gone. It's a power vacuum in Southwest Asia and, in what we now call the Middle East. And so, Israel really eked out an empire for itself under Solomon. But now the tides of history are starting to turn. Egypt is gaining power. Assyria is reforming. The Greeks are starting to claw their way out of their own dark age. And with that, the future of Israel is looking a good bit less certain. And obviously, their kingdom was weakened when they split the monarchy between two kings, right? So Israel itself is working off a smaller area of territory than it used to have. And it's much less centralized than Judah. So Ahab really needs allies. So, like kings tended to do in this period, they formed those alliances through marriage. So there's nothing inherently wrong with him marrying Jezebel. That's not the big problem. The problem is Jezebel herself. See, Jezebel is a follower of Baal. More specifically, there are a few gods that take the title Baal. More specifically, Hadad, the aforementioned one to which the Canaanites tended to sacrifice children, thunder and fertility deity. That guy. She likes it. Okay. So, but it goes beyond just Jezebel's private religious sentiments, which probably would have been scandalous enough at the time, after all, to be a queen of a monotheist kingdom while worshiping another deity probably isn't going to go over too well with the locals. But it goes beyond that. Jezebel wanted to convert Israel to the worship of Baal. She wanted to make worship of Baal normal in Israel, which certainly didn't go over well with, the one true God and all. And the prophets were not having it, and they spoke out quite voicefully that this was wrong, this was a sin, this was contrary to the covenant with God. The Israelites were to worship one God and one God only. And there was no room for worshiping anyone or anything else. As you might imagine, that didn't go over well with Jezebel. And when you're an absolute monarch and people annoy you with their criticisms, you do have the power to order them to be killed. So, yeah, they didn't really hesitate to do that. So many of the prophets found themselves being persecuted, being hunted by Ahab and his soldiers. And Ahab built numerous idols to Baal. And this has often cemented his reputation as a terrible monarch, at least from the perspective of religion. And that's really the biggest source we have on him, which is the Book of Kings, or Books of Kings, rather. And that's important to understand because the Books of Kings have one focus. And that focus is how well does this king live up to the covenant with God? That's their only focus. This is not an exhaustive biography of multiple kings. This is how well does this king jive with the covenant? That's what they're here to, that's the author, the sacred author in those books is trying to discern. So there are large areas of the reign of these various kings that we just don't have. We don't know what's up with these kings. We just don't. There are other aspects of their reign, their military policy, their tax policy, things like that we just don't have. Because the purpose of the sacred author was not to comment on this. There were sources at the time that would have recorded this info. It's just those sources haven't come down to us, so we don't know what they say. All right, so let's talk about this story. This story is a good one. So one of the most interesting stories we get from this period regards the confrontation between Elijah and Ahab. So he's been hunted for a while, and the people are still in this dispute about God versus Baal. So let me just make sure I know it. So they got to come up with something. So Elijah proposes a test. He says, look, we are going to propose a test. Right? Whose God is the true God? let's do an experiment. Pause. Normally, it's not a good idea to put God to the test. That being said, he's a prophet of God, so God's kind of cool with this demonstration. All right, continue. Let's see. All right. So what do they do? So the experiment is kind of clear. Both Ahab and Elijah are to erect 2 altars on which they put the traditional ox that is to be sacrificed as a sacrifice. Okay, cool. So they take the bits of ox and they put it on the altar. They put the fire around it to burn it up, and then they put the sticks and kindling for the fire. And now for the test. The deal is very simple. If your God is real, he should be able to light the fire. All right. King's party goes first. Let's see how the priests of Baal do. Well, they go nuts. They're chanting and they're hooping and hollering and dancing and cutting themselves, doing whatever kind of crazy things they're trying to do, chanting, trying to get Baal to light a fire. And of course, there's no Baal there, so nothing's happening. And Elijah lets this tomfoolery go on for a little bit and then says, all right, my turn, but let's make it difficult. So Elijah then digs a moat, right? Now Elijah and God are about to showboat a little bit. So he digs a moat, he digs a ditch around the altar. And then he pours water all over the wood as if it had been several days of rain. So he soaks the wood with water and he fills the whole moat with water. So now he's just made it harder. There's water everywhere. And then he prays to God and says, give me a sign, light this up. And of course, boom, the whole thing lights up. And the people are in shock. They're in awe. Even Ahab is like, I'm so sorry. You're the one true God. I've strayed, blah, 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 etc., etc. And then Ahab, happy wife, happy life. He's back to, he goes back to persecuting the prophets later. So the conversion of Ahab doesn't really last, but it's an interesting account. So Elijah is later taken up to heaven and what happens is Elijah and his successor Elisha are out walking, and an angel of the Lord appears driving a fiery chariot, and Elijah is taken up into the air and just whisked up to heaven. And he leaves his cloak with Elisha, and Elisha becomes the primary prophet in the area at that point. So whatever did happen to the northern kingdom? Well, the northern kingdom is eventually conquered by Assyria. So the Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, forms the new Assyrian Empire. And as it does, it begins stretching across the Middle East. And it encounters the kingdoms. And what happened was Israel ended up on the wrong side of a war with Assyria, and the Assyrians conquered the entire place. Absolutely destroyed it. Burned the capital to the ground. All the Israelites there are either killed or carried off into slavery. And this is really the last we hear of the 10 tribes from any historical book. And this is where we get the title, the 10 Lost Tribes of Israel. You'll sometimes hear that reference about the 10 Lost Tribes of Israel. They're not out wandering or something. It's that the Assyrians captured them, and most likely they perished in the iron mines of Assyria as slaves, and that was the end of it. They either died or eventually they gave up their, Israelite culture and assimilated into the Assyrian people, and that was the end of them. but that's what became of them. So that is really the end, for the most part, of the story of the northern kingdom of Israel. There are a few caveats to this story. One, there were individuals who did manage to flee the conquering Assyrian army, and many of these refugees fled south to Judah. And this is also where the book of E, the Elohist book, the Elohist source, starts to get incorporated and mixed in with the Yahwist source, right? So they come and they bring their own sacred texts. And eventually, over time, the religious documents of Israel, of the northern kingdom, mix with those of the southern kingdom. And that is where we begin to start seeing these sources get put together to form one narrative. Such that nowadays it's often quite difficult, unless you're familiar with the Hebrew language, like much more, like I'm not familiar with it. I only know a few phrases to tell them apart. We'll talk more about the formation of the Bible in the upcoming lessons. So that is the extent of this. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I will see you all next week.